Let's get started. I know we have the audience still dining in. And good morning and good evening to our audiences coming from around the world. Welcome everyone to join our online dialogue today, co-hosted by Aixin Global and Shenzhen Foundation for International Exchange and Cooperation, supported by City Plus. I'm Li Xin. The topic we'll discuss today is China's opening up in an age of uncertainty. If you, like me, read one of our speaker Kishore Mahbubani's recent book, Has China Won? The opening chapter starts with the clear statement, one thing is certain, the geopolitical contest that has broken out between America and China will continue for the next decade or two. And you can see the cover on Kishore's background. And as we are more than halfway into the year 2020, we also know for sure that the pandemic will certainly affect the world's economy and impact domestic and transnational investment and businesses. So every country is bracing up for the great uncertainties. How China should cope, what adjustment it needs to make, how might the new dual circulation policy and refocusing of economic development on people's livelihood might shape China's future growth. And as we celebrating the 40-year anniversary of Shenzhen being designated as the special economic zone, which is an iconic event that marks the beginning of China's opening up. Can we continue the city's legacy? And can China maintain or even accelerate its opening up? So with all those questions in mind, we bring together four very distinguished guests. I'll quickly introduce them and we'll hear them one by one from the opening remark. So we have Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, Professor Tao Yitao, Vice Chairman of Shenzhen Foundation for International Exchange and Cooperation, and Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow of International Trade Policy and Economic Sanctions from the Peters Institute for International Economics, and Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific for Natixis. So one reminder for our audience today. So one of our speakers, Professor Tao, will talk in Chinese. So please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and choose the English or Chinese channel as you wish. And also we are happy to collect the questions from the audience. So type in your question via the Q&A button. So without further ado, let's first hear the opening remarks from Kishore. As we know that he's one of the most respected thinkers in Asia, served as Singapore's permanent representative to the UN for 10 years, and was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in the US. So how do you interpret the age of uncertainties? Kishore, please.
Thank you, Vishen. It's a real great pleasure to be with all of you. And you're absolutely right when you say this is an age of uncertainty. So I'm going to make in 5 minutes that you've given me 3 points. The first point is that in this age of uncertainty, especially with the United States retreating from globalization in a very significant way, walking away from free trade agreements, undermining the World Trade Organization, leaving multilateral organizations, it's very important for China to stay the course and continue integrating itself with the world and continue with its engagement with globalization. And of course, it will be difficult. And I think President Xi Jinping described it well when he spoke in Davos in January 2017. There's one paragraph, I was there, there's one paragraph I remember very well. He says, when you join globalization, it's like jumping into the choppy waters of a vast ocean. You struggle to swim, you drink water, and you know, you have to really work very hard at it. By the end of the day, you come out stronger. And the record of 2 countries proves that when you join globalization, you do better. Because in 1980, China and India's economies were about the same size. Today, 2020, China's economy is 5 times the size of India. Why? Because China joined globalization. So it proved that globalization works. But a second point I'm going to make is that in addition to the economic reasons for staying on course with globalization, there's also a geopolitical reason. And you mentioned my book in the introduction, Has China Won? As I say, there's absolutely no question that there will be a major US-China geopolitical contest over the next decade or two. That's a given. Nothing can stop this. And so what is China's best strategy? Now, as you know, some people in the United States, not all, believe that the best way to slow down China is to decouple the US and Chinese economies. And that's why the actions are taken against Huawei, the banning of Chinese apps, and so on and so forth. So there's a decoupling process. But this decoupling process will fail if China continues to integrate with the rest of the world. Because then if China continues to integrate itself more and more with the rest of the world, if the US tries to decouple from China, which I think is unwise, by the way, then the US might also decouple itself from the rest of the world that China is integrating itself with. So for both economic and geopolitical reasons, China should continue with its strong policies and continue to march forward towards globalization, and maybe even consider joining things like CPTPP in addition to the RCEP. And I think that would be a good thing for China to do. But the third point I want to address, of course, is that why is the United States retreating from globalization? Of course, the real expert on this is Jeff Short, my friend. He'll be speaking later. But let me give my own interpretation of why the United States is struggling with globalization. I think it's due to three structural reasons. One is, of course, as a result of President Ronald Reagan saying that government is not the solution, government is the problem. There has been a progressive weakening of US governmental institutions. And that's a fundamental mistake because, when you, as President Xi Jinping says, when you jump into the choppy waters of globalization, and if you are on a boat in the choppy waters of globalization, you need a strong captain and crew taking care of your boat. But governance has been weakened. Governmental institutions have been weakened in the United States. And secondly, more fundamentally, and this is a point I actually document in one chapter in my book, the United States is increasingly becoming a plutocracy where all the rewards of growth are going up to the top 1%, and the average income of the bottom 50% has been going down. And if the bottom 50% is not benefiting from globalization, quite naturally, there's a political reaction against it. And that's a result of it becoming a plutocracy and not sharing the fruits of growth with the bottom 50%. And thirdly, and this of course is a very controversial point, I'm just going to touch upon it. One reason why East Asian countries have done relatively well in globalization is that they have some kind of an industrial policy, government management, taking care. If industries fail, we try to help out the workers and so on and so forth. In the case of Singapore, when we had a German camera factory, we trained all the workers. And then when the factory failed, could not compete with Japanese cameras, we said, okay, close the factory, we retrain the workers, right? And that's what you need to do. So that's what is not being done in the United States. And that also explains why the United States is struggling with globalization. But having said all that, there's one point I want to end with. Whatever China does, it should never underestimate the United States of America. There's a reason why the United States has been the most successful country for the last 100 years. There's a tremendous, powerful societal dynamism, and so China should never underestimate the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot of messages and very interesting points that China should never retreat from globalization, regardless of what the US is doing, but never underestimate US. And you also cued Jeff, our next speaker, that why is US retreating from globalization? Will the new administration change that? Jeff, next up to you, but I will briefly introduce slightly more about Jeff. So Jeff served the US Treasury Department between 1974 and 1982. And then has long been advisor to the US government, different administrations, has been member of the State Department Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, and co-chaired the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee for the USTR. So please, Jeff. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to join you and this very distinguished panel today, and the topic could not be more timely and important. We are in an age of uncertainty, and I can't answer the questions about the United States because we have, in the coming 2 months, a great deal of uncertainty about the direction our country, the United States, will take over the next 4 years as we approach a presidential election in the beginning of November. Lot depends on what happens in this election, and policies, while those with regard to U.S.-China relations may continue on a similar course, the difference in strategy and tactics and collaboration could be significantly different. And I'm sure we'll talk about that throughout this program. But it is important to re-emphasize what Kishore has just said. International cooperation, continuing to move forward, to open up to other countries in terms of both economics and society, is critical for the well-being of our people. International cooperation is important both for China and for the United States. And the pulling back of that cooperation has been costly for both China and the United States. I don't think there are many people who can say that the United States or China is better off than we were before the trade war began several years ago. We have been in a lose-lose, in part because we have been hurting each other and hurting ourselves with the reaction to each other. And the trend continues to be downward in this regard because taking actions in support of economic nationalism requires expenditures of wasteful subsidies, requires restrictions on trade and investment, requires disruptions of supply chains that are inefficient and will mean lower productivity for both our economies. That's the path we're on, a path towards lower economic growth, which is not good for either the United States, China, or any of our trading partners. But as Kishore mentioned, there's a much bigger reason why we need to continue to cooperate with each other, to engage with each other, and there's a need for some bilateral accommodation, some modus vivendi for both the United States and China for dealing in support of both economic development and foreign policy interests of our countries. And there are several areas of notable concern where we have to work together or there won't be an international solution. And that includes dealing with the problems on the Korean Peninsula and mitigating the global problem of greenhouse gas emissions and promoting clean energy, avoiding the costly and inefficient decoupling of our economies, right now threatened in the high-tech sector, but that could spread across the board to both manufacturing and agriculture. Constraining Iran's development of weapons of mass destruction. Critical that we continue on this path and find a better solution than the Trump administration has pursued since it walked away from the peace accord of 5 years ago. And of course, certainly in this difficult period of with the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to be working together to develop and distribute COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. But instead, countries are seeming to look out for themselves first and let other countries be damned. And the action to basically gather up all the available potential vaccines is not going to be very helpful for support of international cooperation and for dealing with the plight of poorer countries. So it's critical that the United States and China resist pressures to close, to expand initiatives of economic nationalism, and to find solutions that benefit countries rich and poor. We need to be, as my friend Robert Zellick said years ago, responsible stakeholders. And in the old days, he meant that as a charge for China to take on more international responsibilities. Unfortunately, after 4 years of the Trump administration, I have to include the United States in that camp. And I think if Vice President Biden is elected president in November, he will move the United States back on the road of multilateral cooperation. But it won't be the same. We are in a different world today than we were 4 years ago. And we have dug deeper holes, both the United States and China, in dealing with many of the challenges that we face, both in economics and national security. And we need to find a way of collaborating to allow ourselves to regain the path to openness and promote greater economic opportunity for our peoples. So I think that's a general mark, I think consistent with what Kishore said. And hopefully I'll get a chance to tell you all the problems and what we're doing about them in the United States if we have time in the program.
Thank you, Jeff. And thanks for identifying the bigger reasons that the two countries need to work together and must work together. And that will take tremendous leadership and a vision from both sides. It's a side fact that many of these are not happening, but it also offers us hope that couldn't be a good starting point for the two countries to remain this relationship. Next is Alicia, and tell you a bit more about her. Besides her role as an activist, she's also a senior research fellow at Europe's leading think tank, Bruegel, and a non-resident fellow at Madrid-based political think tank, Real Instituto Elcano. And Alicia has been covering Asia economies, especially China economy, for a long time. Previously for BBVA, BIS, Bank of Spain, European Central Bank, you name it. So Alicia, please share with us how you see, if we zoom in on China's economy, how is the economy doing? And especially, how are things going on the financial sector, which China has been trying very hard to opening up in the recent years?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I feel ashamed to show graphs after this very, very profound talk from Kishore and Jeffrey. And, you know, I love geopolitics so much that I feel kind of really, really sorry that I prepared this presentation with boring graphs, but that was the role I was asked to fulfill, and that's what I'm going to do. But I'll try to touch upon a few of the topics I heard. I just can't avoid it. I'm sorry for that. So I was asked to answer the following question. Is China's economy recovering? And it seems like a little bit of a joke because it's one of the very few countries with a positive GDP growth in the second quarter. So the answer seemingly should be surely recovering, yeah? And I would end there and I would talk about geopolitics and why the economic war with the US is so harmful for everybody. But the reality is that I have to say something more about that recovery that I think is very important, even to better understand why what Jeffrey said, which is that international cooperation is a must, is true also for China. In other words, no matter how much we define dual circulation, Lixin, it will still need, there's no way to hide, international cooperation will still be needed for everybody, including China. So that, in a way, is what I want to convey with this presentation. Let me see if I can move forward. So it will be a little bit about the recovery, what behind those figures, what are the risks, and is financial opening, which is happening, helping, and how much should China rely on it? And my answer will be a lot. It should rely on it a lot. And beyond financial opening, any kind of reform China can fulfill in the current difficult juncture. I understand that very well. So why is the recovery seemingly perfect, but not so perfect? And this is not only China, let me tell you. I mean, in other parts of the world, we're not even recovering yet. So, you know, it's already a big step for China that that you are already showing these positive numbers. But behind those numbers, we see a very, very large role of the state in fixed asset investment. So it's basically about state-owned companies and local governments pushing that investment. And that in itself, and it's not only China, this is happening all over the world, is we are all becoming less of a market economy. And this is true also for China. So that's a warning signal. Maybe in a way, if we all get closer to that model, it might be better eventually. But the point is, it's not the direction I was wishing for the world, but rather the opposite. Second point is the household issues. The still overall through 2020 up to today, negative growth of household disposable income in China. Again, nothing to say about the rest of the world, it would be so much worse, but it does show how difficult it will be for everybody to eventually get to the level we had in disposable income before COVID-19. Now, this is, while it must be terrible for everybody, we have to realize that Chinese households were used to very, very rapid growth of disposable income, from 10% in 2010 to slightly higher than 5% in 2019. So, you know, if your disposable income is growing 5%, suddenly negative is a big shock for the society and for the economy. And the reasons are obvious, you know, the labor market weakness, etc. But I just have to say, this needs to change. It's important for the dual circulation strategy in particular. Without a disposable income, there won't be consumption. Without consumption, it'll be hard to switch to a more inward-looking growth model. The other thing, which relates to why you need financial opening, in my opinion, and it's great you're pushing for that, is the fact that financial risk is increasing in China, very clearly. You can see that from many, many aspects, from the default ratio, which is, by the way, very high also for local SOEs. It's not only the private sector, and the credit spreads widening for lower risk, for higher risk credit. So, and we've seen, of course, valuations for Chinese banks are very low. I mean, we see a lot of that at the time where you most need those financial institutions and where you most need that credit risk to remain low. Central banks in the world are taking action on these with QE, all kinds of intervention. China has not gone that way. I think that is actually wise. But the point is, you still have this situation by which credit risk can hamper the health of many financial institutions and, of course, corporates. So on the basis of everything I said, opening financially offers you many solutions to many of these problems. So at least the problem of systemic risk, because it basically shares that risk with the rest of the world, as simple as that. If the rest of the world is willing to take it, you offer that risk, and that's fine. Not only risk, by the way, you also offer return. You offer 200 basis points above the US Treasury for your treasury. So, you know, and and it's not very obvious which treasury is riskier, by the way. But the point is, you are sharing your financial sector, either through, of course, direct access to your bond market. And here you see the very obvious appeal, because foreign ownership in your bond market is increasing. The very same thing is true for the equity market. So foreigners are flocking into your market. And I think that is in itself not only good because you can diversify your risk and your return, but also because it helps in a way, if not revert, at least contain the process of decoupling. We don't yet see decoupling financially. We hear about some delistings here and there, which, by the way, are never come through, because the number of delisting is minimal compared to the increasing listings of Chinese companies in the US. So I would argue there's so much hope on the financial side of the story for less decoupling. And that's something I wanted to link to the previous conversation, and I'm about to finish. If there's anything, though, that I would add as a concern, is that while foreign investment in China bond market I'm referring to now is increasing. I showed you the share getting close to 3%. You may think it's small, but you know, it started from close to zero only recently. There is a very important thing. It's not US investors. If you look at the US holdings of Chinese long-term securities, it's basically stagnant. So this is something that we need to realize. There seems to be financial integration continuing, but it might not be between the two hegemons. And you see that as well in Chinese holdings of US treasuries, which keep on coming down. And that is a sign to me of concern. On maybe I'll just skip this one to end, and this one as well. To end on a positive note, though, we do see a lot of interest of US both asset managers or financial brokerages in investing in China with full control. Goldman, JP, even others from Europe, as you know, and Japan more recently. So in a way, you would say, well, that contradicts the argument that they're not as willing to invest in China as other foreign investors. Not really, because what they're doing is to intermediate your savings in your market. They're not necessarily, at least that's not what the data shows yet, maybe this will change, bringing US savings into the Chinese economy. Otherwise, we would see those long-term securities increasing, and they're stagnant, at least since end of 2018. So I would end by saying that while we see the Chinese economy recovering, we have to realize, and this will be true for the whole world, that it's not so simple. It won't be an easy recovery. We need consumption. We need that disposable income to be there, and we need systemic risk to remain low. So I think the PBOC has been quite wise in its decision not to overdo it, because the risk is there. But you know, foreign financial investment will help, because it will bring additional savings, and it will also bring more diversification in terms of taking that risk from the Chinese economy, which has been growing lately quite rapidly. So that's all from my side. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alicia. And as Kishore says, there are economic reasons and geopolitical reasons for China to remain open. And thanks for using the numbers to illustrate us so vividly that China needs to beef up its consumption, and China needs to continue its international cooperation. These are the must. And next, turning to our guest coming from Shenzhen, based in Shenzhen, Professor Tao Yitao. So she wears many hats, including director of the China Center for Special Economic Zone Research at Shenzhen University, and she's a true expert on the Shenzhen experience. Advised special economic zone projects for Vietnam, the African Development Bank, and I can name probably a dozen foreign countries or regions. And tell us how the thinking of that you perceive from the government side on the opening up, and what will be the concrete steps, and what will be the opportunities.
各位专家学者好，很高兴有这样的机会，能与各位就目前几乎世界都在关注的问题进行对话。刚刚各位专家呢，从宏观层面上讲了，国际经济发展的状况及其面临的问题。那么我在这里呢，想从微观层面谈一下，粤港澳大湾区，就是什么是粤港澳大湾区。 以及粤港澳大湾区，它为什么无论对中国还是世界来讲，都是一个投资的好地方，或者说充满投资机会的一个地方。那么粤港澳大湾区呢，它是包括香港特别行政区、澳门特别行政区和广东省的，像广州、深圳、珠海、佛山、惠州、东莞、中山、 江门、肇庆这样9个城市在内的一个大区域，通常呢都被称为9+2区域。它的面积呢有5.6万平方公里。截止到2019年末呢，它的总人口是7000万人。那么这个区域呢，应该说是中国市场化程度最高、经济实力最强、开放程度最广、国际化程度最高。 跨境联动最紧密、经济活力和辐射力最强的这样一个区域， 在中国的国家发展的整个格局当中，它处在一个举足轻重的这样的一个战略地位。那我们知道中国的 GDP 城市排名，北京、上海、深圳、广州，那么有2个城市，就是深圳和广州，就在粤港澳大湾区。同时中国经济增长速度最快的城市深圳，在粤港澳大湾区，深圳连续28年是全国经济增长速度排在第1位的。另外呢，粤港澳大湾区它在2019年的 GDP 达到将近12万亿，将近12万亿元人民币。那么粤港澳大湾区呢，它是以不到全国土地面积1%的这样一个区域和不足全国人口5%的这样的一个人口体量，创造了全国13%的经济总量。同时呢，根据世界知识产权组织每年1度的全球创新指数发布呢，深圳和香港地区的区域集群创新能力，从2017年开始就一直是排在全球的第2位的。另外有一点呢，就是非常重要的，就是粤港澳大湾区，它是中国最早的4个经济特区，就中国最早的4个经济特区，有3个在广州，那就是深圳、珠海、汕头，其中有2个是在粤港澳大湾区，深圳和珠海。那么同时，国家的那个自贸区，深圳、珠海、珠海的横琴，还有广州的南沙3个国家级的自由贸易试验区呢，都在粤港澳大湾区。所以粤港澳大湾区呢，它是一个集大湾区、自由贸易实验区、经济特区、先行示范区为一身的，具有巨大这个要素虹吸效应和区域的扩散效应的这样的一个政策叠加的高地。这是一个大湾区的整体情况。那么正因为这样，粤港澳大湾区它无论对国内还是对国外来讲，它是一个充满投资机遇的一块沃土。首先呢，粤港澳大湾区它是世界4大湾区当中地理空间面积最大、人口最多的这样的一个湾区，同时呢，它也是产业的布局最多样化的这样一个湾区。粤港澳大湾区本身呢，它处在经济发展的起步这个阶段，所以它充满了商机。对资本要素的吸引力呢，有一种源于它内生发展动力与建设目标的这样的一种内在的吸引力。比如粤港澳大湾区，中央对它的整个的目标的设定，就是这个区域它要实现区域一体化，要建设国际科创中心，要建立一个宜居宜游宜业的这样的一个优质的现代生活圈，同时它要构建一个具有国际竞争力的现代工业体系。那么这样一系列的目标的确定，决定了粤港澳大湾区它是一个充满无限生机的一个投资的沃土。另外呢，第2点呢，可以这样理解，就是它是一个拥有良好这个营商环境的这样的一个区域，它是一个高效率、低交易成本的投资区域，从而也是可以说它是一个能够充分获得政策红利的这样的一个投资的区域。在粤港澳大湾区，中国政府出台了一系列负面这个清单和这个降低外资进入成本的一系列政策。那么这一系列政策都将有利于外资顺利的低成本的进到粤港澳大湾区，从而有利于外资的发展。
Thank you, Ital, for giving us such a concrete example on how China's opening up will zoom in on one specific region. So with that, we'll move to the second part of our session today, which is more of a discussion and question and answer from us and also from the audiences. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A already, so I'll pose that to the speakers that they want to have answer the question, but feel free to jump in, or our panelists to take those questions. The first question is actually the big eve in everybody's mind. It's addressed to Kishore. Please share with us your view of the coming US general election and how it's going to have an impact on Sino-US relationship. I think that's $1 trillion question. And the second is related. I will put those two together. Is, do you envision an end to the trade war? And if so, in which way would it take place? I think Kishore and Jeff, probably you both can answer that question.
Thank you. I think Jeff actually, in some ways, answered the first question when he said, nobody knows who's going to win the US election. I think even Donald Trump doesn't know, and Joe Biden doesn't know. And I think it's going to be a real cliffhanger. I think it's a mistake to think that just because Joe Biden leads in the national polls, that he will win because of the peculiarity of the American voting system. It's the electoral colleges that determine. So a few key states can swing everything. And around this time, in 2016, everybody was saying Trump is going to lose. And then Trump won. So remember 2016. And so it is realistic to plan on both scenarios of Trump winning and of Biden winning. But the critical thing is that whether Trump wins or Biden wins, it will not make a difference to the US-China geopolitical contest, because the US-China geopolitical contest is driven by deep structural forces, right? And let me just quickly mention three, okay? I mean, of course, they're in my book, Has China Won? One is throughout, for 2,000 years, whenever the number two power is about to overtake the number one power, which is happening within China and the US, number one power pushes down the number two power. 2,000-year rule. So Graham Allison has a book on this. Second, there's been a fear in the Western psyche of something called the yellow peril. Now, it's too complicated to explain this, but it's a real factor. Thirdly, the reason why there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States in support of the US-China geopolitical contest is because both the Democrats and Republicans believe that when they engage China economically, China would change politically, China would become like the United States. This didn't happen. And so there's bipartisan disappointment with China. But of course, this was a very unrealistic expectation that a 250-year-old republic would change a 4,000-year civilization. Very unrealistic, but it's real. That explains the bipartisan consensus. So even if President Biden wins, and I hope they will return to Jeff Short's idea of responsible stakeholders, the geopolitical contest will continue. As the next question is, what will happen to the trade war? I think Jeff can answer that better than probably I can. But I believe that if Joe Biden is seen to be weak on China, so if he suddenly unilaterally removes some of the sanctions or tariffs and so on and so forth, he'll be attacked very strongly. So stepping back from the trade war, I suspect Joe Biden and his advisors will want to do that, but they do have to do it very, very carefully, because the bipartisan consensus against China is very strong, which is why I think China will have to, unfortunately, learn to be very patient again in dealing with the United States, because it will take some time for the United States to work out what it needs to do with China. And China has to be very patient. The United States cannot change right away. I wonder what Jeff is going to say.
Please, Jeff.
Well, I agree with what Kishore has said. The situation, if Donald Trump is reelected, I think is very dangerous because of the instability in his policy and his reliance on very hawkish advisors in the White House with regard to national security. That's very dangerous. But Kishore is right that both parties have to maintain a strong public approach towards China. And so, unfortunately, the new normal in U.S.-China relations is going to be abnormal, is going to be what we see today in terms of the maintenance of penalty tariffs, the increased restrictions on high-tech investment, the increased screening of Chinese investment in the United States, increased restrictions on visas, which is a terrible idea for both countries. The restrictions on visas, on access of media in both economies is making it much more difficult to have a knowledgeable communication between both sides. Very damaging for both countries. But there's this has all eroded the mutual trust that we need to begin to work together, even if we have, concerns and about each other. We have to accept each other for the way the other country is and deal with them in a way that we can both be better off and more secure. And that is the problem I see right now, and I'll leave with one warning. There has been a lot of interaction between our two economies. There is a good deal of movement on financial sector reform, and the special economic zones have created islands of reform within China. But that is all dependent on access to the international financial system. And the danger that I see is disputes, political and security disputes escalating, leading to a disruption of access to international financial markets. And that is something the United States has not done with any major country, but it is something that could be very severe and uncontrollable if we cross that Rubicon. And I'm worried about that, and I will be writing about that very soon.
Thank you. We'll very much look forward to that. Alicia, I want to hear your perspective on that. Do you worry about this?
I kind of quite agree with the fact that we're expecting too much from these elections. I mean, this is a purely structural issue that is a super cycle. I mean, it's not an election cycle, what we're seeing. And in that regard, I think that we need to get used to this situation. And everybody, indeed, should be more patient. But it's not only China, everybody else. I mean, this is true for the Europeans, this is true for the Australians, this is true for the whole world to realize that what's happening is basically a shift in economic power, and that shouldn't happen too aggressively or too quickly, because it will just push retaliation from one side or another, or simply mistrust, which is very costly economically. So that's basically my take. When I said that so far we don't really see major financial decoupling, I was just trying to put that on a positive context of the amount of decoupling we see elsewhere. We see that in global value chains, we see that in trade, we see that in people-to-people movement. It might be because of COVID-19, but not only, when we had the case of visas and the like. So, that's where we're heading. And I guess the more patient we are, the slower it will be. But I don't think that trend will change, to be frank. And we'll have to get used to this new reality.
Be patient and get used to the new normal. And one very specific question on the US-China tech war, addressing, I think Professor Tao probably would be best to answer that question is, how will US-China tech war affect Shenzhen's edge as a tech hub from the Shenzhen perspective?
非常好的问题，而且也是大家很关注的问题。我认为呢，中美科技冷战呢，这要用冷静的思考、冷静的头脑来面对这个问题。首先，这种冷战的发生呢是迟早的事情。一个曾经落后的大国，经过40年的经济发展，一跃成为一个世界第2大经济体，它本身就是对其他大国的一种挑战，或者是一种威胁在那里。那么有防范心理，这是很正常的。但是他以特朗普的方式来表现出来，这可能给我们提出了一个非常规处理的一些思考或者是方法吧。那我想呢，对于深圳来讲，这种科技冷战，首先呢，对深圳来讲是让深圳更加去反思自我，或者是更加来完善自我。这个冷战的开始是深圳有时间或者有精力，能够在思考，在经济高速发展的同时，我们自身缺什么？我们为什么会被一些稀缺要素来制走我们经济的发展？那这就需要我们来自我的反思这个问题。所以深圳呢，很快就在这个方面呢做出了迅速的反应。比如深圳市政府加大了对研发的投入，科研投入，同时加大了对人才的这种引进，通过政府引导投资资金投资的科研研发投入这种方式，加大科研研究的力度，增加自我研究或者是自我创新的这样的一种能力。这是深圳本身政府采取的一些措施。另外呢，这个中美贸易战这个冷战呢，也是很多企业在自我反思。是深圳这个城市40年的发展呢，它一个最大的特点就是它走了一条创新发展创新驱动的这样的一条道路。创新是深圳经济奇迹创造的根本原因，创新也是深圳有今天走到今天发展的一个内生的原因。那么深圳如何靠创新能够继续走下去，能够引领中国经济发展的这样的一个方向，或者让保持经济的一个高速增长，这本身是对每个企业家的一个挑战。深圳有一个很独特的现象，就是深圳的企业按所有制来讲，90%以上的是民营企业，而高新技术产业呢95%以上是民营企业，同时它的研发投入94%以上是来自于民营企业，它的专利发明95%以上是来自于民营企业。实际民营企业家他为了自身的生存和发展，也在自主创新，来不断的从技术上来探索一条可持续发展的道路。所以我想，这个冷战带来的冷思考，给深圳企业家和深圳市政府一个自我反思和自我提升的机会，给高速发展的深圳提出了另一个课题。这个课题就是我们如何能够真正从中国组装走向中国制造，我们如何能够掌握核心技术，使自己的工业能够立足在世界之林，能够稳稳地站住脚跟，在世界经济体系当中站住脚跟。
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the very interesting information that the innovation not just come from the government-led R&D or the government attraction to the talents, but also comes from the vitality come from the private sector, that in terms of the entrepreneur, in terms of the investment on R&D, in terms of the IP registered, all more than 90% are all coming from the private sector in Shenzhen. That's marvelous. And that's why Shenzhen is the hub and also the icon of China's opening up. Another question going to Jeff, I believe, do you agree that China's success is due to globalization or more due to it following a well thought out industrial policy?
Well, no country has a well thought out industrial policy that is well executed, because governments are not good at that in the West and in the East. But globalization and industrial policy have contributed importantly to China's success, economic success. And in the case of China, I think a major contributing factor was the investment in infrastructure, allowing private firms to better produce goods and get goods to market, improving logistics. The big wave of infrastructure investment at the beginning of this century, I think, was really important for the massive growth in Chinese manufacturing and stimulation of domestic demand in the Chinese economy. So I give a lot of credit to those domestic policies, and it's those domestic policies, including opening up on foreign investment, including greater protection of intellectual property, that are needed to continue this new wave of innovation that our Chinese colleague has mentioned is so important for Shenzhen.
Thank you. We have a whole bunch of questions to the financial market and financial sector. I'll move them into a cluster and throw them to Alicia, and you can pick a couple of them to answer. Opening up financial markets will integrate Chinese finance and align it even closer to the ups and downs of Western markets. Is that really good for China? Or in other words, how China survived the global financial crisis is probably due to its insulation from that. So further integration, will that really be a temporary reprieve? Another question is, can China liberalize her domestic stock exchange for international investors' participation? And can China be intensifying an anti-corruption campaign against flies and tigers whilst structural reform in financial regulation is ongoing? So Elisa, pick your question.
Well, basically, the first question goes in the direction that we were insulated financially from the world, and we did well, and we were fully integrated in real terms, meaning in trade and investment, and we did well. Why change that model? First, on the trade side, we're being forced by decoupling, yeah? But on the financial side, why would we follow a different pattern if we did so well before? But that's exactly the point, because the world has changed. So what you could afford before, in other words, meaning being financially insulated and still benefit from the trade integration, is no longer there. So second best, if I may say, is actually to offer what, especially the US, but anybody who exports financial services is interested in. And the point why I think now it's different, meaning you will also benefit, is that your financial sector is humongous. You have 300% of GDP in bank assets, only bank assets. So, you know, if you imagine keeping all of that only for yourself, you're not diversifying away your risk. And I think that at this time of the game, I think it's important, because there is a lot of systemic risk out there. So I see we're not talking about full opening of the capital account, though. That's a different topic. So you are letting people in, they're not very sure how they will get out. And by the time they do, they will help you in a way, you know, like perhaps I would say sophisticate your securitization process which you're undergoing, etc., etc. So I think is the way to go, and you don't have other options, because the rest is actually retrenching in terms of integration with the rest of the world in terms of trade, etc. So that would be my call. I will be very brief on the panda bond market. The question was really, should China allow other companies to raise equity in China? Why not raise bonds other than going offshore, panda bond market or even equity markets? the answer is absolutely, because you have excess savings. So rather than, kind of keep them and force them to invest overseas, you can allow these companies to come to China to issue, and you at least have your own rule of law and your own institutional environment that you know best. So I think it's so much better than just letting this capital be invested abroad to diversify risk. So it's a very good idea, and I think China started with the panda bond market. A lot of that, though, is, however, subsidiaries of Chinese companies in Hong Kong. Is not fully foreign. More foreign companies would be welcome for Chinese investors to diversify their underlying in terms of credit risk. Indeed. I leave it there, otherwise it will be too long. Sorry about that.
All right. Another question for Professor Tao is actually on whether China is going to have a green recovery. Decoupling forces investment on both sides of the new Iron Curtain to replicate existing supply chains and diverts investment from addressing climate change. And how much is the Cold War might diverting resources from greening China's economy? So basically, will the US-China conflicts move China away from its commitment to build a green economy?
我认为呢，中美两国的冲突对中国实现绿色发展的影响，并不是直接的因果关系。中国走绿色发展的道路呢，是经过40年改革开放以来，我们逐渐总结出来的发展经验所得出来的一种发展理念。这个绿色发展本身是我们把环境保护作为经济发展过程当中的一个一项内容，就是环境保护本身就是经济发展的一项重要的内容，而不是经济发展以后的所要做的一件事情。这个理念在10几年前，中国政府已经开始提出了这个绿色发展。最初我们把它表达为和谐发展，人和自然的和谐发展。所以我认为中美贸易战的和中国的绿色发展之间呢，它并没有什么这样的必然的联系。另外呢，我想说一下，我很赞同前面专家的一些观点。我个人认为全球化是一个不可逆转的事情。在经济全球化的今天，我们每个人都在分享全球化给我们个人带来的好处，无论从我们生活日用品的消费，还是一个国家的生产链条的完整，以及资源之间的相互补充来讲，这是一个全球化会给我们彼此各个国家带来好处，会让我们在分享全球化所带来的这个便利，以及在国际贸易当中呢，全球化会让我们通过比较优势获得各个国家获得它所应该获得的更多的要素收入，所以这是一个不可逆转的这样的一个趋势。同时呢，我也很赞同刚刚一些学者讲的观点，无论美国特朗普采取什么样的态度，怎样的在对中国进行这种贸易的这种冷战，或者这个采取封锁，对于中国来讲呢，它是一个庞大的经济体。这个经济体呢，它自身有自身循环的这样的消耗的内在体系，同时我们这种自身消耗的内在体系，就我们说的双循环，并不是对国际化的一种排斥，而是中国经济逐渐的要走向一个新的发展阶段。这个新的发展阶段就从改革开放初期偏重于外向型经济，以外向出口替代为主导的外向型经济，逐渐的走向制度开放。这种制度开放就是我们对国外的资本的引进，我们是以开放的政策姿态引进来的。同时我们向很多领域向国外资本开放，同时我们也不是仅仅凭着劳动力价格低廉，从而商品价格低廉来换取或者占有更广阔的市场 国际市场来获取贸易的顺差。我们是要更可持续发展的，是我们要通过我们产品的技术附加值和资本附加值来获得在国际分工链条当中更重要的位置。那么所谓的双循环，就是我们摆脱从前的单一的外向型经济，摆脱从前的我们以出口替代为主导的这样的经济结构，走向一个能够让自身经济站立起来的这样的一个发展路径，那就是我们靠自身的核心技术，靠我们这个高端制造业的产品来占领，来在国际经济中占领一席之地，让自己能够立足起来。
Thank you, Professor Tao. It was a very interesting discussion, and I certainly learned a lot from each panelist. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Before we close today's session, I hope each one of our panelists can leave a final word. What would be one key takeaway you want to give to, let's say, to China to survive the age of uncertainty? If you can share your brief takeaway quickly. Let's start with Kishore.
Okay, very briefly, even though clearly the US and China have gone very far apart, there is one community in the United States that China can still try to win back, which is the US business community. And as I explained, it was completely unnecessary for China to alienate them. They should bring them back and invite them to visit Shenzhen and meet Madame Tao, and then they'll be very impressed and they'll come back and invest in China.
Thank you. So win back the ally, win back your old ally, the US business. And what will be your advice, Jeff?
Well, first, I would commend the words of Professor Tao. I think she was very wise in noting the importance of the Chinese market and the shift to domestic demand and innovation. But there's good news and bad news. And let me start with the bad news. And that is the frictions will only intensify and disrupt the prospects for innovation because of concerns about access to data security, and privacy. That is key to innovation in so many industries today. And unless there is a way of accommodating the concerns of the major economies of the world, finding a way to work together, we're going to have this continued uncertainty and disruption. And uncertainty is a tax on economic growth. But I don't want to leave on a sour note. So let me say there's one area of where the United States and China can cooperate, indeed need to cooperate, and likely will cooperate in the future. And that is on greening the world economy and working on climate change. And I think that if Vice President Biden is elected, I think one of the areas of rebalancing the US-China relationship will be working together to get back on track and make the Paris Accord on climate change work. And I think that will be good for the United States, China, and the whole world.
Thank you. So can't avoid the thorny questions, but if anything, we can work together now, focus on greening and greening economy and climate change. And Professor Tao, what will be your advice to survive the age of uncertainty?
我说两句话。第一呢，我认为观念不能直接改变社会，但是观念能够改变人，而人能改变社会。这个社会的变化需要我们不断的在变化自己的思想，改变自己的思想和观念，我们才能对变化的社会有一个正确的理性的认识。这是第一句话。第二句话，一个开放的中国将为世界提供中国机会，为中国提供世界机会。我相信 这个世界是在竞争中，每个人都获得自己的利益，从而达到共同繁荣的。谢谢各位。
Thank you. So the change starts from the ideas, and also an open China provides tremendous opportunities to the entire world. And Alicia, you get the final word.
Yeah. So I would just very briefly, three things. First of all, it's all about not underestimating. You know, that's all I'm going to say. Do not underestimate the consequences of the pandemic. We can celebrate that we have it under control, but it's not over, and the consequences will be dramatic for the world. So we're starting on that footing, which is very negative. When things are negative and things get difficult for the societies in the whole world, it is very difficult to expect more cooperation, more, you know, more willingness to work together. If anything, it will be harder than ever. So that's the starting point. Thus, we need